Hello everyone, welcome back to Stories with Alice. Today I'll be sharing a bit of a different story. It's the traditional fairy tale, The Elves and the Shoemaker, but this time I'll be using these little peg dolls as my little puppets. Now you may be wondering why these peg dolls don't have faces on them. It is so that you can use your imagination to put the expressions on them. You can listen to my voice, see how they might be feeling, and then you can translate it yourself using your imagination. So I hope you really enjoy. The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, there was a poor shoemaker. He was a good shoemaker, but there were many other shoemakers in the town, and no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't sell enough shoes to feed his family. Soon he only had one small bit of leather left and no money to buy any more. "Without leather I can't make shoes," he said to his wife. "And if I can't make shoes, I can't sell any. And if I don't sell any shoes, we shan't have any money to buy food. We shall go hungry, you and our children and I." "Well," said his wife, "make one last pair of shoes with that last bit of leather." The shoemaker did as his wife said and cut out the pieces. He didn't have time to sew the shoes together, so he left the pieces lying on his workbench. The next morning, when he came back to his workbench to finish the shoes, he found they'd already been finished. There on the workbench was a beautiful pair of shoes. He picked them up, looked at them. The stitches were so tiny they couldn't be seen. The seams were so smooth they would never rub. They were the best pair of shoes the shoemaker had ever seen. "But how did they get here?" he asked himself. "Who made them?" Since the shoes were there, and since they were so fine, the shoemaker put them in his shop. A fine, rich gentleman came in and bought them right away. He was paid the most money he'd ever been paid before. The shoemaker's wife was able to buy food for the family, and the shoemaker bought more leather to make more shoes. All day he worked, cutting out pairs of shoes. That night he left all the pieces on his workbench, ready to sew in the morning, and went to bed all tired out. The next morning the shoemaker came back to his workbench and found that all the pieces he'd left on the bench the night before had been sewn together, much more cleverly than the shoemaker could have done. The shoemaker put the shoes in the window and sold them once again for a very good price. And so it went on. The shoemaker would cut out the leather for the shoes, go to bed, and when he would return, the shoes would be completely made up, much more cleverly than he could do for himself. Soon everyone was coming to the shop to buy their shoes. The shoemaker was famous, and he was rich. Just before Christmas, the shoemaker had an idea. "Wife," he said, "don't you think it would be a good idea to stay up one night and find out who is helping us?" His wife agreed. So that night, instead of going to bed, they hid in the workroom and waited. At midnight there was a sound of tiny feet, like the sound that mice make. But it wasn't mice that ran across the floor. It was two tiny men They climbed onto the workbench and set to work, with needles as big as themselves and reels of thread that were a lot bigger. Elves, the shoemaker whispered. Elves have been helping us. Poor things, said his wife. They haven't a stitch on. They must be cold, husband. Let's make them some clothes. So the next day the shoemaker's wife went out and bought little pieces of the best velvet and silk she could find. All week long she cut and sewed, doing her best to make the finest little suits with the neatest little stitches. Little velvet jackets and breeches, tiny silk shirts and stockings she made, while the shoemaker used the softest leather to make tiny shoes. On Christmas Eve they finished the gifts, wrapped them up and left them on the workbench. Then they hid to see what the elves would say when they found them. At midnight the elves ran across the floor and up onto the workbench. When they unwrapped the clothes, they put them on at once. They danced around, admiring each other. Why, brother, said one elf, we can't work at a greasy old shoemaker's bench in velvet and silk. I shall never work again, said the other. Not now I'm so fine. The two little elves jumped down from the workbench and ran away. They'd never come back. By now the shoemaker was so famous for his wonderful shoes that he still did good business. No one noticed that his stitches were not quite so tiny, nor his seams so smooth, and he and his family were never poor again.